Hey everyone, it's Adrian from Pink Pirates TCG here, and welcome back to another Beat the Meta video. So this is going to be the last video of the series for this set, just because there hasn't really been any top cut representation for a deck that we haven't talked about. And of course, if that changes with the upcoming Treasure Cups, we'll talk about them. But for now, we've pretty much talked about every meta deck that you're going to see in Top Cut. But don't worry, if you like these videos, we're going to be making a lot more in Set 2, especially with online regionals coming up very soon in March. But with that being said, let's just talk about Law's game plan, starting off with a leader skill. So I think we all know what Law does at this point. One of the most busted leader skills in the game. Once per turn during your main phase, you could rest 2 Dawn, and if you have 5 characters on your board, you could return one of them and replace it with a character that costs 5 or less, but it has to be a different color than the card that you returned. This is absolutely insane when you just think about it like in a vacuum. You're trading 2 Dawn for something that usually costs 5 Dawn. So you're pretty much generating like 3 Dawn out of nowhere. You're ramping a lot of your resources, but it makes it even better when you think about the combo potential that this deck has. Between, like 5 cost Luffy, 5 cost structure deck Law could restand, and of course 5 cost blocker Law just has a ton of combos with this deck to where you get like so much value that we're going to be talking about. This deck can be aggressive, it can be defensive, it gets so much value off of comboing with that leader skill, and it's just such an insanely high skill ceiling deck. And we're going to talk about like the specific combos that you need to look out for when we get into the deck profile later. But for now, let's talk about the in general strengths that this deck has that you're going to want to look out for. So of course, the main reason why you're going to be playing this deck is 1 for the leader skill, and 2 because you could play red and green cards. So what ends up happening is the decks end up just being like the best cards out of both red and green. So you could play a more aggressive red deck that has green tools and searchers that you can use. You could play an aggressive red deck that transitions into like a late game killer that green has, like with 8-drop Kid. After they've like already exhausted like a bunch of their resources, you just drop 8-drop Kid, and it's like the game is like pretty much over at that point. So you just get some incredible deck lists that can do so much. I mean, if you look at these Law decks, they really can, and they have like just a bunch of utility options for them. They have access to Jet Pistol, they have access to Killers, Nekomamushis for every matchup. So it gives you like a pretty great matchup spread into pretty much everything except Kaido. You have like a very even chance to win the game, and you could play both sides very, very well depending on what your preferences are for the deck profile. And this goes a little bit into the next point, where this deck just has like really good offense and defense. Because it could be so aggressive with the red cards, it ends up swinging like very, very often, usually for 5k. It's going to demand cards out of your hand that eventually like Law is just going to outvalue you. And then also on the defensive side, you're running like a ton of chump blockers. Like every Law deck is pretty much going to be running 4 Chopper, 4 Beige, all 1 cost blockers so they could get their effect going. So they're going to be taking life on their own terms. And what you need to do as the person playing against them is whenever they commit like an attack on something and they leave something hanging, always attack for like correct numbers. So for example, if they leave the Zoro out, you don't want to swing Zoro with like 5 or even 6k. I think you should swing with it for like 7k if you really want that thing off board. Why is this? Because you want them to commit. You want them to commit that blocker, commit the cards to protecting that Zoro if they really, really don't want it to die. And then it's like, because the Law matchup is a lot of board control and a lot of staving off pressure. And also for the Law player, like this deck is full of decision making. So them having to make an extra decision, whether they want to protect something or let something go, could potentially be like very difficult for them, especially in like high cost or like high risk scenarios, right? So always keep that in mind. Like if you have the Dawn to spare, swing for the correct numbers. Like if you're swinging at Zoro, swing at it with a 7k, because you really want them to commit those blockers or the cards to block it. And then of course this deck is insanely consistent. You're running 4 Bonnie, 4 Nami at least, And what I want you guys to do as like the person playing against Law is I want you guys to prioritize these search cards. If you have Nekomamushi, if you have KO effects, you really, really want to be using it on these one cost cards, because throughout the game, you are going to see they're going to get so much value because they're going to be returning the Nami back to their hand, playing a Trafalgar Law, or returning the Bonnie to hand with Law's effect. So it's just, there's so many different ways that they could bounce these searchers back to hand and keep them safe and keep them searching them cards. So you don't want to be in that cycle where they're kind of just recycling all of their cards. What you want to do is, like, if they leave a Nami up, you want to attack into it. If you have Nekomamushi, you want to commit it and swing into the Namis. It might feel like it's not worth it, but it definitely is, because then they would have to like block it, which gives up a blocker. I wouldn't really use Nekomamushi against blockers all that much unless they really just don't have any searchers on board. And then this kind of goes into like 7 costs king too. Like if you have the option, like for example, if they have 2 blockers and a Nami, like I would definitely pop like a blocker and a Nami instead of 2 blockers, because the blockers are like tough to deal with, but you know what is also tough to deal with is just a Nami searching them, like whenever they have like a 5 cost Law in play. So make sure you are prioritizing getting rid of these consistency cards, because it's not a normal matchup where like you get rid of it and it's gone. Like they have so many different ways to bounce it. And then of course, this is one of the most high skill ceiling decks. There is so much decision making going on with a player piloting this deck. So the best thing that you can do as you hit their opponent is make them or force them to make hard decisions. So it's just what I was mentioning before. Like if you're swinging into something, make sure they have to give like a couple of cards, or they have to give up a blocker if you can. Don't just like haphazardly swing. Always keep your Dawn, always kind of keep your Dawn very, very efficient within your turns. And then of course, one of the biggest upsides of this deck is just its crazy resource value. A lot of the time, because of the way that Law's effect or leader skill effect works, they just have so much Dawn to work with throughout a turn. So what you want to do as the person playing against it is just keep this in mind. Make sure that they're trading it for things on the board, and then also keep in mind the obvious thing which is like they have to have 5 things on the board before they can use their leader effect. So if you have any effects that can kind of stop that, you know, bounces, green has like the rest and attack effects that you should prioritize. Of course, purple has the just straight up KO effects. You want to prioritize these things because you want to get rid of their board so that it's more difficult for them to use the leader skill in the turn. It's honestly the best thing that you can do against it. They will eventually build up a board, but if you could, you know, kind of stave it off for like a turn or two, that's going to put you way ahead of the Law, especially if you're playing something like green. Like if you could stop their ramp for a couple of turns, it's going to be very difficult for that Law player to come back in the end game. And honestly, that's like the biggest advice I could give you, is just make sure that you're controlling the board first, because you know, Law, you're going to have an easier time closing out the game because they have 4 life. But if you're swinging at them very early and very aggressively at their life, giving up your characters, letting the Law player kind of cruise and take care of your stuff, then it's going to be very difficult to come back, because they're going to have all the card advantage, all the card value. They're going to be able to just reproduce their board that they lost. So make sure that you are exhausting their resources, making them like draw 1 card at a time, you know, so that they can't build this board, and you will be fine. So I wanted to go over the weaknesses, but while making the video, I realized that I kind of tell you guys how to exploit these things in the strength section. So to avoid kind of being redundant, you know, of course, this deck is incredibly hard to play. We talked about it. Make sure they're making decisions that are hard. This is a 4 life leader, of course, so they're going to die very quickly, or a lot easier than other decks. So don't feel bad about like getting a little bit behind early game if it means that they're exhausting cards. And of course, this deck could take a while to start up, especially against things like Kaido and Green, where like they could just like swing at your board as soon as you play something. So you are going to be really wanting to exploit those that weakness, where it's just like a lot of these things are low cost. You can probably get rid of them in the early game and stave off their aggression for like a turn or two. And then also I just added, this deck can get like just incredibly meta checked, especially by Kaido. Like this, like getting 7-dropped kinged in the Kaido matchup is very difficult to deal with this deck. It's a very rough matchup sometimes, but that's just how the decks go, honestly, with this meta. You know, there are different counters and checks for everything. And with that being said, let's get it right into the deck profile, because I think it'll be a lot easier to talk about these weaknesses and strengths when we're actually looking at the cards that we're talking about. So every Law deck is going to be different with their ratios and with certain cards that they run. Like some cards, or some people don't like running the 8-drop kid. Some people like running Hawkins, like I said before. This is just going to be one of the winning lists that I saw on the top decks. So of course, we're running a high blocker count, 4 Chopper, 3 Beige. We're running the 4 of the 1 cost searchers with Bonnie and Nami. That's going to help with the consistency of the deck. And then, you know, you have your Rester with Cat Viper with Izo. You have your killers. And then, of course, you have like your red aggression package with like Nico Robin, Zoro, Monkey D. Luffy, Chet Pistol. And then the bread and butter of the deck, 5-cost Law. You're going to run 4 of that because that's what's going to give you the most value out of this deck, right? I think a lot of decks are starting to run Radical Beam as well. Because you're a 4-life leader, Radical Beam is like very, very useful, because for 1 Dawn, it's just a 4k counter. And this is helpful for your like 8-cost kid. It's helpful for, you know, just surviving those big hits that can go through. But in general, like, you're gonna be wanting to look out for these Trafalgar Laws. If you could get rid of them somehow, or like, you know, the green or the Law player slips up to where like this thing is open, sometimes they attack with 5-cost Law. You want to be getting rid of these cards. You want to get into a position where like it's going to really, really hurt the Law to counter for these cards. So whenever they leave something unrested, you want to deal with the board, because they want to control the board for pretty much the entire game. And like you could ask any Law player, you know, they're going to play for that board control. They're gonna be swinging at you aggressively. And then, you know, if they're playing 8-drop kid, whenever you run out of cards, they're just gonna drop 8 cost on the board and then ask you to deal with it, which can be very, very difficult. And it's just something we need to be very mindful of as people playing against this deck. This is also a deck that you're going to see a lot of in set 2. It's not going anywhere. So I'll make an updated video on that once we get like some good tournament results. Hopefully in March's online tournament, we'll have some more. But yeah, in general, like, just be mindful of like the deck's core play style and its core cards. You remember, you always want to get rid of these search cards like Bonnie and Nami. And whenever you really want something off the board, you want to commit that Dawn when you can. Alright, so that's going to be the end of this video today, guys. As always, thank you all for watching. We're almost at 500 subs, which is super exciting for us. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe if you liked this content. And look out for these Break the Meta videos like in the future for the OP2. We're going to be making an updated one for Law. But I think the first one we're going to be talking about is actually revisiting Zoro in set 2. So let me know what you guys want to see in terms of gameplay and content. Let us know how we're doing. And as always, good luck in anything you guys are doing, whether that's like test or work. And see you on the next one.